All right, welcome everybody to another TLC conversation. Today's talk is going to be about experiment design and KPI selection. And our panelists today, a couple of new faces on the panel, but some new members to the TLC and some longtime members. So thanks, guys. First up is Merritt, currently of Dun & Bradstreet. He's the marketing director for testing and optimization. He established and leads Dun & Bradstreet's global testing and optimization practice, and he's currently focusing primarily on lead gen and sales pipeline. And just a little insider info, he's a really nice guy. I worked with him at Dell, and he's also pretty smart. Second up is Maxwell Hardy of American Express. He is currently the manager of digital analytics and experimentation, and he is focused on test selection with product and marketing owners and developing the framework to prioritize big bets and make sure they're testing the right stuff. Third is John Glinski of Vanguard. Another pretty smart cookie, not to say Maxwell's not, all three are. That's why they're here. John Glinski's at Vanguard, and he is a marketing analytics strategist, and his current, one of his areas of focus that makes it pretty relevant to be here is that he's developing the test and learn methodologies, leveraging sampling, hypothesis testing, and experience optimization. So welcome, guys. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the panel and have the conversation.
Thanks, Kelly.
Having us.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's get started. We have a list of topics that we want to try to cover, but I just want to remind all the callers that you are welcome to ping us at any time through the Slack channel. The TLC calls channel on the TLC Slack is where we'll be doing question and answer, but you can also take yourself off mute and ask a question at any time. This is a really laid back call, and we welcome engagement. So let's kick off with the basic question about experiment design, which is, what are the minimum elements that you need to have a successful experiment? What are the parts of any test design that would be required in order to have a successful outcome that you can learn something from? And we'll just start, actually I'll start with you, Max, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah. So I think some of the core needs there we're all probably pretty familiar with in terms of establishing your objectives and how you can measure against those objectives and getting those super clear. I think the biggest piece, which I learn every week too, is nailing down what the objectives are of the product owners you're working with, because nothing you kind of establish or think through, even from like a purely experimentation mindset, is ever going to fly across the organization if whatever kind of more soft objectives are made available by those respective product owners and marketers. So the business goal and holistically is pretty important, even in some senses more so than some of the other kind of KPIs that we document in our test design.
So what you're talking about there is the fact that whatever you're testing has to tie in some way, shape, or form to the overall business goals, or they're not really going to, the business owners aren't really going to pay attention and or implement anything you learn if it's not going to impact their KPIs, their goals.
Exactly. Tie in and agree to, and will accept the results of.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to add to that, John?
Yeah, I would say along with that, business objectives, obviously key number one thing that you need to focus on. Number two, the way I look at it is you need to know who you're targeting as well and what the audience is that you want to focus on regarding whatever test you're creating. You're not going to be creating one test that's really going to apply to all of your users because all of your users are different. You want to make sure, are you targeting mobile? Are you targeting desktop? Are you targeting, say, high net worth investors if you're in a financial institution, or say just completely new millennials who never invested for the first time? Making sure you have clear understanding of who your audience is going to allow you to have much better results when the tests come in and a much better case to implement when you actually show who the people are that you're affecting.
Okay, I get to be the devil's advocate because I love when I hear this. I happen to know that Vanguard has the capabilities to do this well. But let's say that you are not working at Vanguard and you're working for a company that has no ability to provide a differentiated experience based on your on the audiences. do you then still need, and it's a bit of a trick question, so, but do you then still need to have a target audience in your experiment design?
I'm going to cop out and say it depends, right? If you don't have the ability to segment, and you are able to, say, test run a couple tests and being able to see that they are moving the dial in the right way without segmentation, sure, keep on doing that and see if you can continue to develop and bring in new elements that would allow you, say, for a more mature testing plan going forward, right?
Yep.
You're right. Vanguard, maybe we have an embarrassment of riches a little bit when it does come to certain,
just a little bit,
right? When it comes to certain parts of data. So we're spoiled in that regard, but it is a very good point, right? Where come up with a good business goal, figure out what the test is you're going to run. If you can't target at first, still try to test and see what the outcome is going to be. If it finds out, okay, we really need to really start focusing on a segment, then you need to start thinking through, okay, how can we bring in these different elements that are going to allow us to actually achieve what we're hoping to accomplish in our program.
Absolutely. And like I said, it is a bit of a trick question because there are lots of companies that they're going to do all this work to evaluate all the results of every test by segment, or they're going to target specific segments, but then they don't have the ability to provide a different experience for, your, let's say, new versus repeat, because that's super basic, or for this geography or that geography. So really they've kind of wasted their time, except not necessarily, because if you start with a use case and you say, these are my visitors and these are why they're here, and we need to make sure that their experience, because maybe they're our most valuable segment, that their experience is a solid one. And, we want to make sure it's not to the detriment of the other segments if I don't have a way to give them a different experience. But thinking that way puts you as an analyst and as an ideator in the shoes of your customers and gives you, I think, still a better experiment design. So that's why I challenge it, but I also totally agree with it because I think experiment design needs it. So.
I mean, Kelly, if I may, I think you're also you have to tread lightly when you're thinking about targeting a test to only a specific segment, because it sort of implies that what you're doing may not be relevant to other segments. And then there's a whole, there's ramifications of like, okay, well, if this wins, am I only going to push this live for a specific segment? Or am I just being lazy or maybe like, opportunistic about taking the easy segment and testing for them when really I haven't thought through the design for mobile or thought through how this is going to globalize. So, I mean, you really, like, going back to what Max was saying, like, starting with a business objective, like, you also have to account for actionability of your test. And the best test designs are those that have a clear plan to implementation if the test is a successful outcome, right? So, like, if I don't know, I've seen many tests that, like, we get an outcome and it's a winning test, but then, you get caught up in implementation because you haven't really thought through all of the details of how this is going to impact your full set of customer traffic. And, it's fine implementing on just a subset of traffic, but then you have a lot of, you have higher overhead costs to maintaining unique experiences, and you get into the challenges of personalization.
Yes. And the only piece none of you mentioned is the piece that I'm sure you're all already doing, even if you're only putting it in your head and not in your actual experiment design. But that's, what decision will be made based on the results of this test? What change needs to be seen? What lift? Whatever, in order to make that decision? Because I think that is an important one, and I know I've talked to two of you about it, so I'm pretty sure you're already doing it. But that's super important because it gets everybody on the same page before you ever launch the test. What are we learning? And then if you apply that goal of what you want to learn to your experiment design, it also ensures that you're not testing things just to test them. I don't want this, A, B, C, D, E, F, or this ridiculous multivariate setup just because somebody wants to know if blue's better than green. You're like, no, what are we learning? What decision are we going to make? And if it's not something you can make a decision, then maybe it doesn't belong in the test.
Well, and the other thing, I would just add one more thing to that. I think that's a good point, is that even when the objective is not like a core quantitatively measurable KPI, for example, you might just have a test where you're just thinking about which UX does best, or what downstream metrics you might be trying to drive. That is not always kind of tied back to a specific conversion holistically. And so you just need to be very clear at the outset that your test is not trying to drive at core KPI A or B.
Which segue, were you going to say something, John? Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to that, right? And I think it comes down to the robustness of your measurement plan up front as well, right? Where, okay, we have a couple key things that we want to measure and test the effectiveness of, but we also need sub-metrics as well to keep an eye on. So maybe for this one target audience, like conversion rates are through the roof, right? But it's at the cost of, Merritt's point, it's at the cost of like the rest of your population. So I think it's really important to keep an eye on the entire ecosystem as much as possible without having, say, 1,000 metrics that you have to look at.
Which again, Merritt and I had a lovely little conversation earlier about micro and macro KPIs, and I think that's what you're referring to, Max. Is, you know, I'm not going to focus on this particular KPI that is maybe the overarching business goal, because, you know, that doesn't make sense based on where I'm testing. But then you get into the philosophical conversation of, how do I know that this thing that I'm measuring is actually going to impact that thing that you really care about, and how do you guys get there? So let's talk a little bit about that, about the KPI piece. How do you pick the KPI, and how do you get the buy-in there? You want me to call names? All right, fine. John, you start.
Okay, I'll start. I knew it was going to be me. Just tell. So I think, again, we've said it so many times, right? But first off, figuring out what you're trying to solve for in the first place, and understanding what are those measurable outcomes that you want to see happen. Ideally, whatever you're trying to measure is going to tie to some overall business goal, right? Is it increased cash flow? Is it higher conversions? Is it better, say, NPS, brand perception? But those are so high level, you do need to take it down a step and being able to figure out, okay, well, what KPIs that we can measure based on our test are going to potentially influence those maybe high level KPIs, where maybe our test is not going to be directly influencing conversion rates or directly influencing brand or NPS, right? So really having a good conversation of understanding what is in the realm of your control and being able to really focus on those pieces, whatever the test is, regardless of what it is. So just having an understanding of what you're hoping to influence, what you can influence, and then being able to really get into the weeds and figure out what is measurable and being able to implement.
I think I feel like a good, like your KPI selection comes out, it gets teased out naturally if you have a good solid hypothesis framework, right? If you start with I believe that if we do X, then Y will happen. Okay, implicit in the Y is an outcome, right? And that should, like, funny how many times I've seen like the Y is then not tied to like the KPI that's being measured. Like, we believe that if we, you know, take a field out of our lead generation form, that we will see higher, we'll see higher form submission rate, but it may come at the cost of a lower SQL rate, sales qualified leads, right? So, and then like the only thing that you're measuring for then is like your form submission rate. And so like when you frame that hypothesis well, like the KPI should flow pretty easily from there. And if it's not, it's just it's a blaring hole in your test framework.
And even before the hypothesis, so in our testing documentation, our hypothesis comes after our objective, right? So objective is everyone can align. It's very important. You're just having that one sentence objective. Hypothesis coming after that. So how are we going to modify that objective? So you're right, embedded in that, there's some KPIs there. But in order to kind of separate out what your test objectives might be from the business objectives, we also have those as two separate kind of line items here. So an objective of the test might drive towards these overall quote-unquote macro business opportunities, but on a more micro level, there is a separate test objective which is driving towards that. And I agree that like out of that statement, it should be boiled down as much as possible. You're going to have some KPIs, and so what I like to think about is how are we going to measure against this objective? How are we going to ensure that this is a success? And you can even ask your partners something along the lines of, what would be a successful outcome from this experiment? What would you like to see happen? And then those are the elements that are ultimately your KPIs. Whether or not it goes up or down is the next question, but at least you know what a good outcome from them would be.
Do you guys do any pre-work in your KPI selections to identify KPIs that are predictive of other, let's say, quality conversion metrics? I know, Merritt, you were talking about lifetime value, but not everybody goes quite that far. But are you guys doing any work to decide, we need to focus on these KPIs because we know that people who do X, Y, and Z are more likely to do A, B, C?
I think that's for sure. I mean,
go ahead, Merritt.
Go ahead,
Merritt.
All right. So we do for sure. So yeah, Kelly, we were talking earlier about lifetime value and how difficult it is to. I mean, I would wager that it's impossible for most people to actually measure lifetime value as their test metric, right? So you have to use sort of assumed values, but we definitely do that. Like our three big measurements of success on our website are like how many inquiries we get in for our sales team. So, and those break down into form submissions and chats, like live chats that happen with sales, and also inbound phone calls. And it's funny, we've done a bunch of analysis to look at the value, like the relative conversion rates into sales pipeline of each of those channels. And we have to measure all three of them. And it's not enough to just look at total leads and the impact of total leads from your test, but we actually drill down into, okay, how many chats and how are those chats typically valued relative to form submissions?
Right.
And it's tricky, right? Because there's no guarantee that the next additional chat is going to be worth what the prior one was. And so it's flawed at its core, but it's the best we can do to sort of lick our fingers, stick it in the wind, and say this is where this is going to put us. I mean, ultimately, I kind of think that's the case with all of our metrics. This is what we were kind of like going back and forth about, Kelly, is that like I think all of I can't say all, but for what I've seen, most of what we're measuring are shorter term outcomes than what ultimately like drives the business in the long run, and we just kind of accept those assumptions and move forward with the best we have.
What were you going to say, John?
I was going to say some of what Merritt said, so that was well put.
Yeah,
Good
I
job,
mean,
Merritt.
yeah.
Go ahead, Max.
No, I mean, you have to be able to boil. Is boil up a term? You have to be able to bubble up your KPIs against the overall business objectives. But you're right. The connection is somewhat tenuous, but you have to kind of. There's a reason you're doing this work, so you have to figure out what that link is to whatever extent you can. And we do look at downstream metrics that way.
There definitely is a piece of, we believes of what we're doing, right? Like we believe what we're doing now is going to better our business in some way based on this experiment. And we hope that there's not going to be some sort of unforeseen butterfly effect where butterfly flaps its wings on one coast and causes a hurricane somewhere else, right? So we're doing everything we're doing with the best intentions, essentially. And we can see short term, but to your point, long term is very, very difficult.
So one of the ways that I've seen folks mitigate some of that risk that you're talking about, where we're trying to influence KPI A, but they're worried that they might have a negative influence on KPI B, is that they actually include more than one KPI. They have a primary and a secondary or multiple primaries. And if they build out something like a results matrix or in their test requirements or whatever ideation document, they say, this will be a win and we will do X, Y, or Z if this improves and this other metric is not negatively impacted. Have you guys seen that, and do you use it, and are there any inherent issues with it, any pros, cons, anything?
I gotta laugh because I mean I have so many thoughts on this, but like, yes, I've seen it, yes, I've tried to use it, and yes, I've seen it get ignored. Like you could do so much work on the front end of like, these are all the possibilities of what we may see, but I still seen so many decisions just be made in spite of that planning that you did. Like, I don't know. Maybe I just have a sour taste in my mouth from having those be ignored in the past. But it's like the conditions are never quite what you expected.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, right, where it's challenging too, where how you're socializing those primary and secondary KPIs as well, right? When you're sharing multiple numbers with business leaders, it's harder for them to digest, right? And you don't want them getting confused and saying, hey, well, the secondary went this way. And even though you tell them not to look at that, really, it's not that important, right? Like, based on like what we're saying, it all comes down to the narrative, really, right? First, it's what the data is telling you, and then how you're going to actually socialize that. And are you going to share multiple KPIs with your business leaders, or are you just to show them the one number? And I think that's need to use discretion there for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I gotta wonder then, John. Like, do you think it's is it like a lack of discipline in our decision making, approach? Like the fact that it does come down to a narrative?
No, it's just organizations that are ill-equipped to think this way. At least for us, there's a quantitative arm to this research, but product owners respond much more positively to qualitative research because it's easy and feel. So yeah, I think the narrative is very important there.
Yeah, and it depends on the maturity.
I agree that it is, but like, should it be in every case? Just because we don't just because the why escapes our comprehension, the what is still there. I mean, the data more or less is informative.
But the decision makers aren't robots or machines. They're people. Yeah. And if you can't explain to a way that they can understand, they're probably not going to follow through with your recommendations and next steps.
Right. And it's completely based on the maturity of your organization too, right? We would like to think we all have analytically driven decision makers at the top of each of our organization. We also know that's probably not true in every case, right? So it does come down to a narrative, right? And it is about hard facts, and that's where we're at, right? That's what we do for a living, but it's also about trying to share that in a way that it'll actually resonate, right?
So I know it's kind of a different direction, but Kelly, you mentioned like looking at multiple metrics. So my reading on statistics and the use of multiple metrics is it can be dangerous depending on which statistical framework you use. But like typically, if if you use a t-test to analyze your results, the math tells us that for each additional metric that you add to the mix, you increase your error rate. And that's not something that we typically a lot of us think about in our test design. I'm wondering how, I guess I should be weighing in on this, but like we try to steer clear of the t-tests, right? We steer clear of frequentist statistics when we can, and we use a sequential model. I'm not a statistician, so I don't deny the fact that we could be making mistakes here and there, but
are you trying to plug for next call?
I'm just curious how the other two have dealt with those limitations.
Yeah, I am also not a statistician, so I really can't comment on this. We're fortunate enough to have an analytics arm to our team that helps us kind of understand what the downstream impacts are and also in our test design up front. So I recommend it.
Yeah, I also want to add, I'm also not a statistician. Right. And,
hi, my name is Kelly, and I am not a statistician. The good news is
but you're expected to be, right?
Right, a little bit. You're expected to understand it and explain it. So I just want to let everybody on the call know that March 2nd, we're actually having a talk about statistics and testing, and we're bringing not one, but two and maybe three statisticians. So be there, you can ask these questions then, Merritt, and then maybe somebody can give you a more intelligent answer. Then.
Yeah, I'm also aware of the fact that I'm supposed to be answering questions now and not asking them.
That's
so.
right. That's right. Speaking
Yeah,
of answering questions, Rusty has a question, so you better do good, John. All right, Rusty's got a question over in TLC calls. He says, opinions or experience performing experiments with the goal of optimizing brand KPIs in addition to traditional conversion metrics. I'm going to start with Max this time because I know you guys use a lot of qualitative data in ideation and everything. And like you said, they don't really care about the numbers. If you can give them a quote from a customer, they're like, oh, we should go do that thing. So obviously they would be more likely to look at brand. Have you guys done any testing where you're actually trying to measure the impact to the brand or the brand relationship?
It's a good question. As my other peers here, like brand is everything for us, so it's very important. So how do we qualitatively?
Qualitative or quantitatively? How do you test it? What KPI would you use?
Yeah. So I mean, the best way that I can think about that is we can tie in our results to overall customer satisfaction ratings with the site, which go directly into our JD Power kind of ratings. That's the data that is informing that. So based on what segment our users are falling into and engaging with, we do at times look at kind of those downstream impacts to customer satisfaction. So there's a bit of that's more of a quantitative side of things. Qualitatively, we also tie some of our results into user surveys within the actual experiment. So after users gone through a modified experience, we might kind of ask them to take a survey at the end of that. And that can be helpful too. Again, it increases buy-in if we're having some of that feedback.
Some pushback, yeah. Cool. How about you guys, John?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, right? Because depending on your brand too, right? Like if you're well known, say like an American Express or something like that, right? Like how much influence could you actually really have on, say, the overall brand, right? That's like the macro level, right? But like micro, you want to make sure that people are at least having good experiences. That is where that qualitative data is so helpful, being able to, collect it via surveys or something along those lines, right? Because quantitatively it's really challenging. It's really, really challenging. And I think we're still trying to think through that, where we're at, right? Because, with Vanguard, it is, people know us and it's whatever we want to do. We want to make sure we do no harm up front, but we also want to make sure we are moving the dial in some direction as well to make sure that we are making some sort of impact.
Yeah, I don't know that NPS is the, the gold. I don't know that that's where I want to go, but the idea of evaluating how well your experiments do at moving your customers from maybe satisfied to brand evangelists. If you could say, if you had a way, if they were frequent visitors, if they were, existing customers and they're coming back on a regular basis to check in, and every once in a while you're popping this little 2-question survey, are you happy with us and would you recommend us? And you're trying to track how that moves over time. I think that would be fascinating. It just seems like it'd be really difficult to do.
For sure. And there's also low-level ways to measure brand too, right? Like take a look at direct traffic over time, or take a look at like organic search over time. And you can, make the assumption maybe that that's because our brand is going in the right way and more people are resonating. Tying that back to an individual test, it's kind of tricky, right?
Right. Rusty's giving you hints. He says, confident in decision made, easy to deal with, trust, maybe the context of the buying experience. I guess those are things that we could create proxy KPIs for. We think that they're confident in their decision made if they do X, Y, or Z. Maybe we could do a survey-resurvey method where we look at, we ask them the question, then we survey them later, and then we look for a behavioral signature that matches what they said, and then we can look for other people who didn't answer the survey that fit that characteristic. I don't know. I'm just noodling here. What do you think, Merritt?
So I think there's plenty of criticism out there for just about all these types of like brand measurements like NPS and satisfaction and ease of doing business with, et cetera, et cetera. I think something's better than nothing. I think the best we can probably do in these is make sure that people are having a good experience and measuring that. We do something similar to what Max was describing, where we have evergreen surveys, and then sometimes we do specific surveys related to specific tests. But then we have that data available within our analytics tool where our test data is also available. So we often will look at the impact on satisfaction of each test recipe, and we'll compare those. My experience has been that those can be difficult to interpret, especially if they're going in opposite directions as your performance data in the test. And then you're sort of left with like this, like, oh man, what, this is really good, but like, this was not so good, and what do we do with that? I mean, and that goes towards the challenge of using multiple KPIs in your evaluation criteria. So, the performance-based one versus the sentiment-based one, those are especially challenging when they don't line up together. But I don't know. I still think that's maybe the best thing we can do towards measuring the impact on the brand, right? Like, generally speaking, like, how are people responding to this? How do they feel after they participate in this experience?
Merritt, do you remember the brand test that we did many a year ago, where we did an optimization experiment? They wanted to show the sale amount of Dell's high-end products, and the brand team was worried that would devalue that high-end product brand value. So they did the test to look at the impact of conversion, and then they did a separate focus group asking people to look at pictures of our brand and other people's brands showing sales prices or not, and then value them, and then you tied them together. It was still obviously the people who were doing the focus group, they didn't see the test experience. We don't know if they would have been more or less likely to buy or increase their conversion, but they did have, the ability to say, I think, if on a scale of 1 to 10, this is a high value, low value, whatever, high quality, I think is what they say, high quality or low quality brand. And then we were able to say, hey, look, we increased conversion by this much, and the impact to the brand value was measured in this way, and this was our experience. So, I mean, it's not using your testing tool or your testing program, but it is tie it together in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting approach, right? And I think, Kelly, you bring up a really, really good point, right? Where I think a lot of us, every time we think about like test and learn and testing programs, we automatically default to digital because it's easy, right? And that's just kind of standard. But you're going to have market research groups, you're going to have usability groups, you're going to have all different types of groups that you can actually leverage to get learnings from, because it's not just about testing online, it's about learning, right? And getting smarter at what we can do. So if you could actually leverage a focus group to actually inform what your test is going to be, that's great, right? You can actually run a smarter test. I mean, you're not going to do that every time because resources, and that's expensive for sure. Yeah. But for like those bigger tests that you really want to focus on, where you really maybe not have like really good KPIs that maybe would not stand up all the time, right? Well, yeah, why don't we leverage some of our other partners within an organization who all the time live in silos a lot of the times, right? So,
Yeah.
Well, and John, I think you make a good point too in that sense, because if we're able to be selective in what we choose to experiment on, so taking the existing kind of qualitative research that's been done that is a result of people's feeling about the brand and prioritizing experiments that contribute to that, you can at least do a year-over-year kind of analysis on those particular features and say, hey, I ran 2 or 3 tests on those products, and we got an uplift, and the brand value may have gone up because of it.
So I actually have a question, and since Max brought that up, right, for the group. So how does each of your organizations handle learnings and learning libraries and being able to capture those learnings and socialize that over time, right? Because it's a lot of times I've seen many organizations, you run a test, those learnings get lost after a couple months, and then people end up running the same test again because we don't remember what happened a year ago, right? So how are you guys cultivating those learnings and making sure that they're actually in a resource that can be leveraged?
Merritt, why don't you start? Yep, go.
We maintain a testing blog. It's an internal blog, and we try to do a post for every single test, and also for some of our research projects. So a lot of our usability studies we'll do a post on, or any other sort of interesting analysis done. We tag it. So you can kind of look up winners, or look up things that dealt with navigation, or look up things that were just usability testing. I wouldn't say that it's that people proactively go there, like when they're like, oh, I'm gonna like work on this landing page and let me go look on the blog to see what tests they ran in the past year on the. But it does come up frequently in conversation, and it keeps the conversation accurate, right? Because I don't know what happens in your organizations, but when I see people remembering tests, it's like their memory just turns into a fuzzy ball of like either it was good or it was bad.
They remember what they wanted to remember.
Yeah. And so they're like, if you tested some messaging and that didn't work, like suddenly that whole category of messaging is bad and it doesn't work, rather than just that test. And so it helps steer that conversation and like, keep it accurate, and then we can go back and reference it when we need to. And it's worked pretty well for us. I will say that there are tools out there that do this in a more automated fashion for you a little better. There's one project management tool called Effective Experiments that basically creates a blog post out of the metadata from your test workflow. And so, I mean, that's actually something we're looking at onboarding in the next couple of months here, but and one of our use cases for the product.
Right, because even with KPI selection, like a resource like that would be incredibly helpful, right? So you can actually see how people are tying to certain measures over time and making sure you're looking at the right thing. But to your point, right, not everybody is going to look at the blog just because momentum of, say, whatever project they're working on or something along those lines, right? But it's good to have it for sure.
That sounds like a really cool tool. I'm definitely going to look that up. We have a situation where we have too much documentation, and we're trying to figure out how to do a little better job. So we use Confluence a lot. I love Confluence just to document what we're doing. So one thing I've tried to start thinking a little bit more about is speaking the language of our product owners. So creating a page, one simple page on Confluence about the experiment in the similar format that a product owner uses to develop new ideas for his or her product. And therefore you're kind of speaking their language and able to speak to what they might be most interested in. But yeah, there's a lot of other documentation stuff I can talk about too. But
Max, I feel like you're hitting on something really important there. It's like it's not just about like documenting, but like doing it in a way that people can navigate and that speaks to them. Like one thing we really try to do with our blog posts is make them visual, right? Because people, that's easy to understand, right? If you have like huge spreadsheet tables, and that's your blog post, right? Just a bunch of results, and then like, paragraph after paragraph of documentation about like what you did and how you did it. That's like, no one's ever going to consume that. We try to make it as visual as possible, like boil it down to like the key insights and make it so someone can scan it, just like we do with the web page, right? We want it to be easily consumable.
And Neve has made a good point over on the Slack. And Merritt, say hi to Neve.
Hi. Wow.
I know, but she makes a really great point about the learning library idea. It's important to remember that the learnings are not evergreen. So John, when you started the question, you said, what is your solution for making sure that people don't, retest things that have been tested? And I think to Neve's point, there's a little pushback there, because just because it didn't work when you first tested it doesn't mean it won't work next year, because there's, the internet is very much so ever changing. And sometimes if you're a little ahead of that, that bleeding edge of change on the internet, your customers, especially your brand, may not be ready for it, but 2 years down the line, maybe they will. So there's something about that. And I think whatever repository you use, whatever way you use to capture your insights and share them, I do agree, Merritt, tagging is incredibly important so that you can sort and filter and find things that meet that goal, but you should also date them. and repeatability, and so we tested this on this date, we confirmed it in this other locale, or on this other target audience or whatever, and we've repeated it once a year, and it's holding up, that kind of thing. I don't necessarily mean it has to be once a year, but if you have something really important, I think it's worth validating it and putting that data out there. Let's talk about the minimum changes needed to make a decision. When we talked about the intake inputs, we covered all the basics, but one of the things we didn't cover is, what would you need to see to make a decision, and how does that impact your, let's think about the back end, the analysis side. You make a decision up front to say that, this is our business objective, this is our hypotheses, these are our KPIs, and the next piece of is, you're going to determine the runtime, typically, based on some sort of estimation of lift. And I've seen companies that just, play with calculators until they get their runtime to 2 to 3 weeks, and they say, okay, we have to get a 6% lift. But they would actually be willing to make a decision and pull the trigger for a lift that's smaller, or maybe they're not willing to make a decision and make a change unless the lift is at least 10%. But they're not calculating their runtimes based on that. And they're also having to do this big deep dive analysis because they end the test at 3 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever. And then they have to find some learning or insight in there, even though they're not going to make a decision based on anything else. So I'm curious, what is your all's experience with calculating or figuring the minimum change that's needed to make decisions? Do you even ask those questions of your stakeholders?
I can start and say that we don't. They would usually ask us about those questions. So a lot of our stakeholders are very hands-off in terms of getting into the nitty-gritty of the actual test design, which is good. Allows us to be fairly autonomous in that sense. But we have, it's a bit more challenging for us because a lot of our, what is considered success is not necessarily about engagement or even anything that the testing tool actually measures itself. So it is a challenge. It's a manual process to determine when something is completed and what kind of uplift we're looking for. We kind of just run it for, a decent amount of time and try to get as much data as possible, and then try to salvage what we get
on the back end, because you can't tie them together in the tool.
Yeah.
That makes sense. It doesn't preclude you from also, if you think about the cost of experimentation, I mean, it's way cheaper than having your development team go and build a new experience or tool or page. If you can do it more lean through your testing tool and evaluate, is that a good thing?
Yeah.
But it's still costly. You still have development, design, maybe you have copy, maybe you have legal. In fact, I'm sure all of you have legal, but some compliance, whatever. There's a cost to the time associated to running a test. The more complex the test, the more time, and time is money. So if you can calculate the cost of your test, wouldn't it make sense that you also think about how big a lift would need to be for the test to pay for itself? How big a lift would need to be if you had a win and the test ran for 3 weeks and it paid for itself during that 3 weeks? Or if they're more flexible, once it goes live, it needs to have paid for itself within the first quarter or something like that. You guys aren't looking at that at all yet? And I say yet?
I think that's valuable for sort of high level discussions, prior to engaging in a project. But I've rarely seen those sort of details be like rigidly adhered to. I mean, I think what John was saying about the narrative plays such an important role in the decision-making process after the test data has been collected, or even while the test is running. It's more about the holistic picture of what's going on and crafting that story and telling it to others, because I just have not seen any stakeholders adhere to any sort of disciplinary measures when it comes to the hard values of those KPIs, right? Even when you ask them, like, well, okay, we've got this big launch coming, and typically launches, you see a decline, and how much decline are we willing to go with, like given all the investment that's gone into this project? And they waffle on it. They're like, oh, I don't know. And you're like, how about 5%? Oh, okay, 5%. Well, if it's 6%, you think they're going to turn away? No, they don't.
Right.
It's just there's so much gray area that it really just comes down to how, like, it pains me to say it, but like how people feel about the results. And in the context of like, well, what does the trend look like? And like, how much volume are we looking at? And like, what do the other KPIs look like?
Yeah, I think go ahead, John.
Go ahead.
No,
so,
no,
right. I think it's completely, it's so challenging and even more ironic, right? Where, the tests that we're creating, we want to be as statistically significant as possible. We're making sure that we're actually having results that actually really hold their water, right? And making sure that, okay, we're not doing any harm. We're actually seeing success. Great. We're very confident in the results. Then we hand that off to the decision makers, and then, well, okay, so no decisions are actually being made then, or they just decide to completely scrap actually implementation for whatever reason. I mean, that does go back to the fact, right, where data is just one piece of any decision, and it's not going to be an easy button. Completely understand that, right? But with the scientific rigor that we try to approach with everything that we do, and then kind of leads to this little fuzziness when it comes to implementation, it's always an interesting conversation, for sure.
It is. And I think, honestly, in all three cases, it really would make sense to start, even if you're not sharing the information. You can use it for prioritization, which I know, Max, is a big focus for you. But if you start looking at what is the investment break point, where do I break even on this experiment? And then, I'm sure you're already looking at the level of effort for, design dev, maybe even analytics, maybe setup, whatever. If you're already doing that, apply a little back of the, envelope math to the investment hours, to the investment complexity, and use that as saying, okay, this is how much it's going to cost us to run this experiment. How big of a lift would I need? Even if you're using and which I'm sure you all are, a proxy for something that's going to move a needle revenue-wise, even if it's brand, whatever it is, you have some idea, or somebody at your organization definitely does, the value of a lead, or the value of a conversion, the value of, satisfaction. And if you don't, you guys need to get there. But if you can do that and you can tie those together, now you can say, okay, intelligently, I know that this test is going to run 3 weeks. I need the lift to be this high in order to pay for a break-even investment. And then instead of asking them, how big does the lift need to be for you to make a decision, you can tell them, we need to see a 3% lift, and this test would have paid for itself, or this test, if we get at least a 3% lift, that will pay for the development time for you to actually go and implement this based on the results. And it just gives you a different argument to make,
Again, I think that's useful at a 10,000-foot level, and like useful in prioritization, right? Like, I don't think there's a prioritization model out there that doesn't take into account the potential impact that the idea could have, not just on like the specific audience, right, but like in the broader business set, and the level of effort or the cost that's going to be associated with that project. But I mean, if you're saying that like you're going to put a dollar value that, like, if you're saying that you can like firmly estimate the cost of development time and development hours that are going to go into a project, I mean, I take a lot of issue with that. Like,
not firmly.
There's so much stuff that could come up that changes the value, right?
Absolutely.
Your range is going to be tremendously huge. So
yeah, but you use the same T-shirt sizing in your prioritization. Why wouldn't you use it in an ROI calculation? Basically, that's what I'm saying. The same assumptions that go into your prioritization, apply those into an ROI calculation.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. What was the quote Matt shared? Let's see. All models are wrong, but some are helpful. I like it. Okay, we have 8 minutes left. If anybody has any other questions that you guys want to ask the panel, throw them into the Slack or raise your hand now. And while you guys are thinking about that, I'll throw out our last question that we had, which is about, slightly more complex tests. So if you're talking about multivariate or some of the bandit testing, auto allocation, type of thing, or any personalization or targeting, how does that impact your experiment design? Does it impact the intake, the minimum required elements? Does it impact the KPIs? What do you do differently, if anything? Max, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just start by saying most of what I know I learned from Mel here. So if I get this wrong, it's her fault. So, and she'll know that I say this all the time. I'm all about simplifying tests. Like, I think we should just like boil everything down and do more of smaller tests. That's kind of what I push my partners to think through. Just in the sense of we're trying to get core objectives and learn about what those results are. So that's item number one I would raise there too. Item number two about personalization, and this is true I think for everyone else who's doing experimentation behind in a logged in experience where you're a member of some kind, and that's obviously true for us and what we're doing. I'm kind of mixed on this approach of, do we personalize an experience and target certain, in our case, card members, or do we release it to as many types of people as we can, get and then just segment out the results into different segments that we're interested in looking at? So my personal opinion is I do more of the latter, but I'd be curious to hear what others do.
Yeah, so I will agree with Max when it comes to simplicity is best. I think we've really focused a lot on trying to just run, say, A/B tests and kind of, maybe shy away a little bit more from like MVT testing a little bit. And I think the reason for that goes back to my point I made earlier around the narrative, right? As you're sharing those results to your stakeholders.
So hard to explain.
It's so hard, right? And we were just talking earlier about getting their buy-in if like one KPI moved, right? Just for like, say, an A versus B treatment, try introducing 6 different variables, and you have to go through all the results and show them all the treatments and all that. And I try to make whatever I can deliverables as boiled down and simple as possible. So completely agree with Max on that.
Yep.
I think with the personalization, we're still trying to crack that a little bit and trying to figure out what the best approach is going to be. I really feel we're kind of opting for more as a segmentation type of approach as of right now, but we're really exploring, really seeing what's going to have the highest impact. And hopefully within the next year, we're going to be way more mature than we are today.
So another thought here. I mean, I know like Ronnie Kohavi and the like, they talk about how important it is to have a single overall evaluation criteria, right? A single KPI that rules the rest, and that you can say this is the decision-making metric that we are going to use.
We should just call it the one ring.
The one ring to rule them all. And he talks about how hard that is, and I agree that is really difficult, and in a lot of cases it's just not possible. But that is the limiting factor in using some more complex methodologies, like multi-armed bandit. I don't think you can do that with more than one KPI, right? You have to let the machine go based on whatever that single lever is that they're pulling.
That's right.
And if you have a very nuanced test analysis structure that relies on you interpreting multiple metrics and deciphering a story from those metrics, like it's not gonna work in that environment.
All right, Matt, I know you're on the call. Bookmark that. Let's I'll put it in the notes for March 2nd conversation on testing and statistics, because if there is a way to do bandit type testing with more than one KPI, we'd love to hear it. So keep that for next week. But anyone else have any other thoughts or comments or questions? All right, so let me give everybody a couple of reminders. He's going to check before then. We're all going to prepare to be educated. Okay, so our next conversation, as I've said a couple of times now, is March 2nd. We have 2 panelists still waiting to find out who the third is going to be, but we have Matt Gershoff and Dr.
I'm headed to go hang out with my lab.
Hello? I'm not sure who that was. Okay, and Dr. Aaliyah Fight. I hope that's how I pronounce it. And then instead of 2 weeks, we're going to go 3 weeks due to spring break. And my spring break anyway. And so March 23rd, still soliciting a couple of panelists. We have an encore request for the conversation about tips and tricks in testing. I have 2 people who would like to have 2 to 3 additional folks. It's an easy conversation to have with several panelists. So anybody interested, ping me. And as a reminder, anybody who hasn't yet signed the code of conduct, send me a note and I'll make sure you get the link. And anybody who hasn't joined the Slack, send me a note and I'll get you a link, because I'd love to have more conversations going there. We get some good questions and not enough people to engage. So you guys join. It's a great place to communicate in between calls. And thank you very much. I'll send out the notes and the recording. Thank you to our panelists, Max, John, and Merritt. You guys were great. I really, really appreciate it. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kelly.
Awesome. Thank you.